Have you ever wondered what might happen if the forest itself decided to return something it had taken? 3 days after their young son Benny vanished into the thick Oregon wilderness behind their home, Eleanor and James Walker found themselves clinging to fading hope. Yet on that third morning, something shifted, something subtle but powerful enough to stir the air around their quiet kitchen table. The search teams were tired, the helicopters grounded, and the Walkers were being gently prepared for the worst. But Eleanor refused to accept that her boy was gone. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the towering pines of Redwood Ridge, she stared blankly into her coffee, her hands trembling from sleepless nights. Across from her, James gripped his mug with white knuckles, his voice rough from calling Benny's name until his throat burned. When he whispered that the search was being scaled back, Eleanor felt a new kind of fear bloom inside her, deeper and sharper than anything she had known during her difficult pregnancy or the cancer scare that had once threatened James's life.
This fear was hollow and endless, the kind that only comes when a child is missing. But before despair could swallow them, a sound tapped lightly against the living room window. Not the frantic knocks of a neighbor or the hurried rap of law enforcement, but a measured, deliberate tapping that made both parents freeze. When Eleanor approached the window, expecting perhaps a branch blown by the wind, she instead found herself staring into the golden eyes of a bobcat perched calmly on the porch railing. In all their years living at the edge of the forest, they had never seen a bobcat this close, and certainly never one that seemed to be waiting for them. It tapped again, slow and purposeful, as if asking for their attention before stepping down from the railing and walking toward the forest's edge. It paused, looked back, and held their gaze with unsettling intelligence. And in that quiet moment, Eleanor felt something strange, almost like a pull, a whisper of possibility she didn't dare name yet. When the bobcat returned the next morning and repeated the same ritual, tapping 3 times, waiting, then walking toward the trees as if inviting them to follow, Eleanor could no longer ignore the feeling in her chest. She felt as though the forest was speaking to her, urging her forward with a sense of purpose she couldn't explain. James hesitated, torn between logic and desperation, but in the end, he laced his boots and followed her because he couldn't bear the thought of her going alone. What began as cautious steps onto the porch soon became a determined trek deeper into the woods than they had ever ventured. The bobcat led them through towering groves of Douglas firs, across hidden creeks that shimmered in the sunlight, and up fern-covered slopes that felt untouched by time. Each pause from the animal felt intentional, each backward glance urging them to keep moving, as though it understood their grief and had chosen to guide them. James marked the trees with bright surveyor's tape so they wouldn't lose their way, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her heart pounded with a fragile hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel since Benny disappeared. After nearly an hour, they reached a small clearing where the remains of an old cabin stood, its weathered walls sagging beneath decades of neglect. Yet despite its decay, something about the place felt strangely preserved, as though it had been waiting for someone to return. When Eleanor pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, the faint light revealed dust, broken furniture, and an eerie stillness, but also something that made her inhale sharply with recognition. There on the floor lay a small red knit cap, one she had placed on Benny's head the morning he'd disappeared. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, pressing it to her face as if hoping to breathe him back into her arms. And that was only the beginning, because a photograph hanging on the wall revealed a face from a forgotten era that mirrored Eleanor's own family features, setting in motion a trail of secrets older than the town itself. As the bobcat slipped silently into the shadows outside, its task seemingly complete, Eleanor realized this was no coincidence. Something in these woods was connected to her family, something buried, waiting, and awakening. And whatever truth the forest held, it had just begun to reveal itself. Have you ever noticed how a single evening, seemingly ordinary at first glance, can quietly plant a seed that reshapes someone's entire future? That question lingered in Daniel's mind long after the door closed behind Thomas that night. As he stood in the quiet hallway, the soft hum of the house settling around him, Daniel felt an echo of something deep and unspoken, something that refused to let go. It wasn't just the worry of a friend, it was a sense that a much larger story was beginning to unfold, one that he hadn't asked for, yet somehow felt responsible for. That lingering thought followed him into the next morning, where the day began like any other, but carried a subtle heaviness, as if the world around him understood something he didn't. At breakfast, the warm sunlight spilled across the table, catching the rim of Daniel's coffee mug as he listened to the faint noises of birds outside. Everything looked peaceful, almost deceptively so. But as he scrolled through the morning news, a sudden headline about layoffs in a nearby town tugged at him, stirring an uneasy connection. It wasn't the same company Thomas worked for, yet it felt too close, too timely. Daniel pushed the thought aside, but the tension stayed like a shadow in the corner of his vision. When he arrived at work, his assistant greeted him with the usual morning updates, but Daniel's mind drifted, replaying Thomas's strained voice from the night before, the way Thomas had stood in the living room as though the walls were closing in on him. Through the day, Daniel tried to focus on meetings, schedules, and the steady rhythm of routine. Still, every small pause brought back the image of his friend's forced smile and the heavy silence that followed every sentence. During lunch, he found himself staring out the window, watching leaves flutter across the pavement, and wondered how long Thomas had been carrying that weight alone. The thought pulled at him, urging him not to wait, not to assume time would make things easier. By late afternoon, he couldn't ignore it any longer. He sent Thomas a message, simple yet sincere, asking how he was feeling and whether he'd like to talk again. But hours passed with no reply. As evening settled in, Daniel drove home under a sky painted with fading streaks of orange and violet. The road ahead blurred slightly as he replayed every moment of their conversation, trying to catch details he might have missed. He wondered if Thomas had eaten, if he was resting, or if he was sitting alone wrestling with thoughts too heavy to speak aloud. The worry deepened with every mile. When Daniel finally stepped inside his own home, the familiar comfort felt strangely distant. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stared at his phone again. Still no message. That silence felt louder than any words. A gentle knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to find Emma standing there, holding a small stack of papers. Her expression softened when she saw his face. She told him she had come by to drop off some reports, but when she noticed his tension, she paused. Emma had always had an unspoken understanding with Daniel, a way of sensing when something was wrong even before he said a word. He hesitated for a moment before sharing a few details about Thomas, careful not to break his friend's trust, yet wanting someone else to know the situation felt serious. Emma listened quietly, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. She placed the papers on the counter and offered a sincere, steady reassurance that he wasn't overthinking it, that sometimes the strongest people hide the deepest struggles. Her words didn't solve the worry, but they added a sense of grounding Daniel hadn't realized he needed. Later that night, as Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the quiet of the house pressed around him. He felt the weight of unspoken fears circling in the background. Yet he also sensed the faint beginning of resolve. Something told him that Thomas's situation wasn't just a passing hardship. It was the start of a chapter where choices mattered, where silence could be dangerous, and where loyalty might demand more than simple check-ins. Daniel leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the shadows along the wall, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he wouldn't wait for a reply. He would go see Thomas in person, no matter how uncomfortable or intrusive it might feel. Because sometimes, Being a friend meant stepping in before someone asked, before it was too late. And as that thought settled into place, Daniel felt a quiet clarity rise within him, signaling that the story was about to deepen, and he would need to be ready for whatever came next. Have you ever followed something wild and unexpected, only to realize it was leading you to a truth far bigger than yourself? That question hovered in Eleanor Walker's mind as she and James trailed the Bobcat deeper into the Oregon wilderness, each step feeling heavier with anticipation and fear. The forest around them seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets they could almost hear but not fully understand. The Bobcat moved with a grace and certainty that was unsettling, pausing occasionally to look back at them as though measuring their resolve. Eleanor's heart pounded with hope and anxiety, every instinct screaming both caution and urgency. She and James had no map, no guide, only the strange intelligence of a wild creature that had chosen to trust them, and they had chosen to follow. As they trekked through groves of ancient Douglas firs, over hidden creeks and up moss-covered hillsides, memories of Benny flooded Eleanor's mind. She remembered the small, bright laugh that had filled their home just days ago, the little hand that had held hers while learning to ride a bike, and the empty feeling of seeing his favorite toys abandoned in the yard. Each memory strengthened her determination. She could not allow the unknown to claim him. James, despite his skepticism, kept pace beside her, marking trees with bright tape to ensure they could find their way back. His own fear was tempered by an unspoken belief that something extraordinary was guiding them, something beyond logic. After nearly an hour, the undergrowth gave way to a small clearing, and there it stood, a cabin. Old and weathered, its roof partially collapsed and its walls worn to silver gray. The Bobcat paused at the threshold, its eyes meeting Eleanor's in a way that felt almost human, and then stepped aside. Eleanor swallowed hard and approached the door, feeling a mix of dread and hope twist inside her chest. When she pushed it open, sunlight slanted through the gaps in the roof, illuminating decades of dust and neglect. Furniture sagged under layers of grime, and the air smelled of time itself. Yet in that stillness, Eleanor saw a small red knit cap lying on the floor, unmistakably Benny's. She grabbed it with trembling hands, pressing it to her face as if she could draw him back through the fabric of memory. James bent down to inspect the walls, lifting an old black-and-white photograph from a rotting frame. The man in the photo had features so strikingly familiar, it made Eleanor's breath catch, his eyes and jawline echoing her own family's. A sense of destiny pressed in around them, a realization that the forest had not only protected Benny, but it also guided them to a secret older than anyone could have imagined. The Bobcat, silent and watchful, had led them to a place where past and present intersected, where hidden truths waited quietly for the right moment to surface. Eleanor felt a shiver of recognition. The forest was not just a backdrop to their lives, it was a participant, a guardian, a silent witness to generations of secrets. And as she lifted Benny's cap again, holding it as if it were a key to a doorway she had never known existed, Eleanor understood that this journey was far from over. There was more to discover, more to understand, and she was ready to follow wherever the forest and its mysterious guide might take them next.
What would you do if a stranger in the forest held the answers you had been desperately searching for? Eleanor and James Walker stood at the threshold of the clearing, staring at the figure emerging from the largest tent, a man with long gray hair tied back and clothes that seemed both practical and timeless. His eyes, sharp and familiar in some unplaceable way, met theirs with a mixture of caution and recognition. This was Silas Alder, the guardian of the hidden family who had lived in the forest for decades, carrying traditions and secrets older than the town itself.
Eleanor felt her breath catch as the connection between her family and this hidden clan began to reveal itself, the photograph they had found in the cabin suddenly making sense in ways that sent chills down her spine. Silas spoke carefully, explaining that the Alders had maintained a way of life that honored both the land and its creatures, living alongside the Bobcats not as pets but as partners, indicators of the forest's health. Every word he spoke seemed to echo the same quiet authority she had sensed in the animal that had guided them here, a connection between humans and the wild that defied simple explanation.
As they listened, Mara Alder stepped forward, her presence gentle yet commanding. She had been the one to find Benny, tending to his ankle and offering comfort while he had been lost and frightened. Eleanor's heart lifted with relief and gratitude as Mara explained how she had guided him safely to the camp, following principles that had been passed down through generations of the Alder family. It was a way of life that balanced survival with respect, secrecy with compassion, and in that moment, Eleanor understood that the forest had not been cruel but protective, testing and guiding rather than abandoning. Finn Alder, Mara's young son, watched Benny with curiosity and quiet pride, showing him how to notice tracks, listen to subtle signs in the wind, and recognize the patterns of the forest that had always existed just beyond the view of ordinary townsfolk. The walkers realized that Benny had been cared for, nurtured, and taught lessons that blended knowledge of the wild with ancestral wisdom. Silas spoke again, his voice firm but kind, reminding them that this knowledge and heritage were part of Eleanor's own lineage, connections that had skipped generations but never disappeared entirely. The Bobcat, now quietly seated nearby, watched them all with serene intelligence, the same creature that had led them here, now serving as a silent witness to the reunion. Eleanor felt a profound mix of awe, gratitude, and understanding. Their son was safe, their family was connected to something far larger than themselves, and the forest had revealed its secrets in a way that would stay with them forever. In that moment, the walkers knew that the journey had changed them, opening a doorway to heritage, respect for the natural world, and the realization that being lost sometimes leads to finding truths beyond imagination. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to step back into the ordinary world after discovering something extraordinary? Eleanor and James Walker walked slowly along the forest edge. Benny carried carefully in James's arms, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across familiar paths that now seemed both ordinary and magical. The Bobcat, their silent guide for days, padded alongside them before slipping back into the trees, leaving only the memory of its piercing gaze and quiet authority. Eleanor held the smooth stone Silas had given her, feeling the weight of generations, heritage, and secrets held close by the forest. Benny chattered softly about his new friends, the lessons he had learned, and the gentle care that had kept him safe. Eleanor and James listened, hearts full of relief and wonder, realizing that their son had returned not just unharmed, but transformed in small ways, attuned to a world they had never fully understood. As they reached their porch, the town beyond the forest seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different to them. They had glimpsed a lineage, a connection, and a responsibility stretching far beyond their home. The forest had not only returned their son, but had reminded them that family, legacy, and the wild are intertwined in ways both visible and invisible, and that sometimes being lost is the only way to truly find where you belong.